Network sniffing. In this nugget, we'll be addressing the issue of sniffing, and this is something where the term actually comes from another product called Network General, if I remember right, but it's a way of being able to pick up packets off the wire that might not be destined for your computer, but that you can pick off the wire anyway. You need to use something called a promiscuous sniffer in order to be able to do that, and it uses a driver called PCAP in Linux. The principal tool that we use, the principal software tool that we use, is something called Ethereal. I always want to call it Ethereal, but Ethereal. There's also a Windows version of Ethereal, and for that you need to download WinPCAP. One thing we can do with Ethereal is to sniff passwords. I mean, that's the gold mine there, right? You can sniff all different kinds of passwords. I'll show you some of the kinds you can find. And then we'll talk about sniffing on hubs as well. Hubs are pretty easy to sniff. You really don't have to do anything extra. But the switches, boy, that's the hard one. You can't always be successful, and switches will certainly circumvent or curtail the amount of sniffing that you can do. We'll take a look at ways to get around that. I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people that has to see things visually. I mean, we've looked at a lot of utilities and things where we just see a spit out on the screen of all different kinds of scrolling text for hosts that are alive and some ports that are open and some that aren't and all this different kind of thing. But one utility that kind of helps you get a visual reference for a lot of this is called keyops. Now, I've already installed keyops here, and I've installed from a tar file a 0.2.3. That's the version I've got. There's also an RPM file for you Linux guys, but I found that has a lot more package dependencies, which send you into that vicious circle of having to find one package and installing it, and then finding out that it's dependent upon another package, and then installing that package. So instead of getting into that loop, I've installed this older version, but it still works very well. In any case, once it's installed, I'm going to just do a keyops-agent-n, and I'm going to hopefully I won't forget this in the future, but I'm also putting an ampersand at the end of this. And again, the reason for that is so it returns control of the console here to me. Okay, so now I've got the agent running, and it looks like, oh, big whoop, it went to sleep. I mean, what's this thing really doing here? Well, by itself, it doesn't really do anything. In order to make this happen, I need to type in a couple of other commands here. So let's just go ahead and do an ls, and if I do an ls keyops, then we'll see that there's several different commands or several different files that start with that keyops. And that's just another way of searching for files if you're in that same directory where you want to locate the file. In our case, I have another command here that's keyops -ng that I want to run, and as with Linux, you got to do a // in order to run that from the same directory, as long as it's not in your path. So I have to type that in, then we get this going. Let's see what we can do from here. And I haven't actually run this utility yet, but I think it'll just accept a local host for the host here, and I couldn't do it. So let me try something else here. Let me try its IP address. I think I'm at 10.10.10.43. And we'll let that run. There we go. Okay, so now it's gone ahead and connected. What I need to do next is pretty simple. There's not that much to it. All I have to do is to go into view space, and I can add a specific network to this. And if I want to map out a whole subnet, well, I can do that. So the network address is 10.10.10.0, as you've seen me type in many times in the past. And I'm going to use a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. So my 24-bit subnet mask, and we'll go ahead and OK that. All right, now what we see happening is it's already identified a few hosts here, and it's going to scan these for a while, but kind of gives me a visual layout of the network. If I had some routers and things involved here as well, it would show those to me. And right now we see question marks on a lot of these. What it's going to do, and this is just asking me what kind of a pixel display I want for these computers here. I'll just leave it at that for the time being. But it's asking me, what it's doing here is it's identifying the operating systems on these various hosts. Now, this is something else that can, again, get you false positives sometimes. So, for example, here, you can tell by the little penguin, it thinks that that's going to be a Linux installation on that host. Well, it's not. That's just one of those consumer level, what do you call those? Linksys routers that I plopped into the network here just to kind of throw some things off here. Well, we can see that it thinks it's Linux. It's really not. As we go further along, and I'll just kind of let this run perhaps in the background, then we'll see that it starts to identify various hosts, and we get a visual picture for what's going on here with keyops. So in any case, while keyops is running in the background here, I'm going to go ahead and go to another directory where I've installed, and I never can pronounce this right for some strange reason, but it's ethereal. I always want to call it ethereal, but it's ethereal. In any case, I'll just do a /ethereal. I'll train myself into saying it right as soon as I start to learning how to type properly. And we'll go ahead and launch this, and we see we have a network analyzer that we can work with here. Now, we saw this a little bit in a previous nugget, we were able to capture a few packets here. This is going to be a pretty critical tool in the hacker's toolkit, and Ethereal is pretty well seen as the one to use. Now, the reason why this is a good utility is because it's just a passive sniffer. It's just watching traffic go by on the network. Kind of reminds me of my dad. Whenever we used to go shopping or something like that, my family would go shopping. My dad, he would just not go into any stores. He'd just sit in the mall, and he'd sit there, and he said he'd just watch people go by. That's what he liked to do, is just watch people. He never approached anybody, never talked to anybody, anything like that. Same thing with the Ethereal here. It doesn't do anything. It just kind of sits there watching the packets go by until something interesting happens, and then you can decide what to do with those packets and what you want to analyze. Now, when you first start using this, you have to identify what network adapters, even if you've only got one. You have to still specify that when you do this capture. By the way, I think I mentioned this before, but there's also a Windows version of this, which seems to work very well. You do have to install WinPCAP in order for it to work with Windows. So in case, I'm going to go to Edit here and Preferences. This will be a permanent change, a permanent selection of my network interface. Otherwise, I could just go to Capture on the menu up there and choose one for only this session. In any case, I'll go ahead and select one right here, and I'm going to go ahead and identify which one I need to use. So under the Capture item, I've got my, and we don't have much screen space to work with here, but we've got my Ethernet 0 network adapter here, and I can capture the packets in promiscuous mode, which is what I'm interested in. And in any case, just like with many of my dialogues here, it's too big for the screen, so I'm going to right-click on the title and move, and I can move up here, and I'll save it and click OK. Now I have my interface ready to work with here in Ethereal. I did it again. Ethereal! Well, we'll just consider them synonymous. Okay, so anyway, we're going to go ahead and click on Capture here to start our new live capture. Then we're going to take a look at some of the traffic here that we'll be able to pick out that can be kind of interesting here. So what I'm going to do with this then is I'm just going to minimize all my virtual machines here. I'm just going to go here and maybe I'll go to a command prompt. Even try to log into an FTP server somewhere. How about FTP? And I'll go to FTP dot, just one that I happen to know of. And as you hack, you start to find out various EDUs that have interesting stuff for you. But in any case, FTP is what I'm trying to type, not F. Anyway, you get the idea, FTP. And we're connected, and now it's asking for a username. So I'm going to type in a username. How about, and it doesn't matter if it's the right one. What I'm demonstrating here is that a lot of these things you can really get interesting information out of. Administrator. And the password is, who knows what. We'll just type something in here. Okay, so I typed in a password. Now, it was incorrect in this case, but that doesn't matter. Let's just assume that someone typed in a password that was the correct password. Now, with using Ethereal, what we're able to do is to pick out that particular transaction and see what was going on. Here I was connecting to that FTP server. We saw a DNS query for that. That's what was going on here. And we got an answer back from our DNS server. And then as we made a connection to that specific host, let's go ahead and see what kind of traffic we were receiving back from it. And as we scroll down to the bottom here, we see that we did have an FTP transaction going on there. And look over here to the right. Request password. I know better. That was the password that I typed in. You see, this is where tools like this can come really in handy for a number of different reasons. There are a lot of different network functions that take place, and the credentials that they require are not some sophisticated SSL shell or something like that, or SSH connection or anything like that. No, they're just sent in clear text, or plain text is another way of describing it, meaning that any packet sniffer like this can just pick the password right out of the air. In fact, there are other tools. Let's see, what's another one that I can use? I could use another tool called LinSniff that could also do this, and that's LINSNIFF. Just do a search for that one. Well, that particular tool also just doesn't show all this other stuff, all this other network traffic here. It's not like that, like Ethereal is here. Instead, what it does is it just looks for usernames and passwords, and it'll identify the ports that appeared on the IP addresses and things like that. And that'll just show you any passwords that are going back and forth across the network. So very, very interesting information that we can get out of that. All right, here I've started another trace. Let's go ahead and take a look at this one. This time I'm going to go to, again, my Windows XP host right here. I'm just going to telnet to a server. Again, a lot of administrators do like to use telnet. A lot of telnet is used for administering switches and routers as well. And although there are ways of encrypting it, a lot of times it's not, and it's pretty easy pickings. So here, if I go ahead and log in according to whatever the guy's name is, whoever it is that's logging in here. We'll enter in another password. Okay, and a very complicated password, and the login failed, but that's all right. We'll just, assume that we had a legitimate log on there. And whether it's good or bad, this packet sniffer will pick them up either way. So as I go down here to take a look, once again, we're going to see that we got some very interesting information. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, that's kind of interesting, but what's really the big deal with FTP? Well, here's the deal. A lot of times, website managers are not really that technically adept. I mean, they can put together a beautiful web page, all kinds of flash animations and all kinds of really cool stuff on it. Make it look nice. However, they're not as technically adept, so when they upload, it's very common to upload the content from your workstation as a web designer up to an FTP server. And that's how we very often will upload our web content. Well, of course, we're going to have to log in using FTP. And if someone's sniffing the traffic, they're going to be able to snatch that password out of the air. If it's a disgruntled employee or something, well, they know now that credential, and they can then deface the company website and, post confidential memos up on the website or something like that. So this can certainly be a very sensitive issue. Now, as I was showing those illustrations of, how to sniff traffic, some of you might have been thinking, I guess we could do that, but it doesn't seem like it'd work with us because we're using switches. Well, for that, let me illustrate how this used to be done in the old days. It used to be that everybody had hubs, or most people had hubs. And with a hub, what happens is when this host sends traffic to the hub, they, of course, have their network cable plugged into a port on this hub. Maybe they're trying to connect to an FTP server or something like that out here on the internet. Well, when they send that traffic through, anybody else, such as my attacking computer here, is also connected to the same hub. So their traffic goes out through the port to the internet, but I also happen to overhear that traffic. The only reason why I don't do anything about it in a normal network situation is because my host is going to respond only to traffic for whom it is destined. So if I see or hear traffic that has foreign IP addresses that I'm not involved in, then I just kind of ignore that traffic. It's kind of like, us geek types. We get invited to a lot of cocktail parties, right? So you might be talking to somebody at a cocktail party in a corner, and you're just the two of you are talking. Your ears actually hear everybody else talking, but mentally you really only pay attention to the one person you're talking to. Well, that's kind of the way a hub is. A lot of traffic, a lot of noise going on, but you really only pay attention to any traffic that's destined to or from your host. Well, that's all great, but having cleared up my diagram here, what if, some genius network administrator gets the idea, hey, everybody's sniffing the traffic off of the hub, and everybody's getting each other's passwords and things like that. By the way, I didn't mention this before, but here's just a few examples of the traffic you can sniff off of a network. I get my pen back here again. FTP, which we already looked at. You can also get telnet traffic. That's going to be many times transmitted in the clear, although there are ways of encrypting it. It can be clear. POP3. You want to find out what email somebody's getting? Just sniff their POP3 traffic off the wire and then configure your Outlook or some other solution to use their username and password, and you can download their email. So that's another thing that can go on. A lot of different kinds of things are able to sniff this traffic. So the network administrator gets the bright idea and says, hey, man, people are stealing each other's passwords in our network. We can't have that. So I'm going to instead install a switch. Now, most of you that work in a corporation, that's probably what you have these days. Unless you're in an older corporation where people are not as technically adept, you're probably going to have a switch. Among other things, the switches are more secure, which is, of course, the big topic for us, but they're also extremely much more fast. Is that good English? They're extremely faster. No, that's not good English either. Anyway, you get the idea here. You see, what happens with the switch is, when I send communications into this switch, then the traffic on that switch is dedicated to the port. So I send traffic out to the internet, and the traffic is dedicated back and forth only through my port. On a hub, it's shared bandwidth. So if that hub is capable of 10 megabits per second, and I have 10 hosts on that hub, then we're all splitting it up so that, at least theoretically, we're all really only getting maybe a megabit per second. With a switch, most of them these days are 100 megabits per second. Well, we get almost, at least theoretically, a dedicated 100 megabit per second traffic. Now on Ethernet, usually you're lucky if you get 50% of that, but it's still substantially faster. So we get a big performance benefit, plus we get privacy. You see, now when I'm communicating through that switch to my FTP server or whatever it is out here on the internet, nobody else can sniff that traffic because my port is dedicated just to me, and the switch handles the traffic back and forth isolated between our hosts. Now, there are still some things for which you're going to be able to see everything on all ports, but that's going to be broadcasts or any kind of an ARP request. ARP is Address Resolution Protocol, and that's simply what happens when I want to contact, 10.10.10.5, and I'm on a 10. Network here. Well, since I don't know who 10.10.10.5 is, well, I have to send that out through all the ports on the switch, and then whoever .5 is will answer back and say, hey, that's me. After that point, once I've resolved their MAC address, their hardware MAC address to that IP address, and it's in my ARP table, then I will dedicate communication back and forth to that specific host. So you can get some limited sniffing off of it. But you have to work with ARP in order to do that. Also, another thing you can do is to identify things like where the DHCP servers are, because of course they will respond when someone does a DHCP broadcast, and they send out their Discover packet. All right, then, so how are we going to circumvent these switches? Well, first of all, let me point out from the beginning, you can't always do that. A lot of these switches, especially the higher end ones, can detect a lot of the things that we're going to do here. But some of the older ones, or some of the ones that are not as sophisticated, we can get away with this. One of the things you might try doing is something called MAC flooding. This is where you're going to just send out millions of fake MAC addresses to the switch, and it confuses the switch, it gets flooded, and when it gets to a certain point where it gets too confused, it just says, hey, I'll just fail over to what we call fail open mode. And when it does that, it switches over to hub mode, where it again broadcasts all the packets through all the ports. So it's pretty aggressive, pretty sloppy, easily detected. But if you're trying to get by with it, and you only need to capture traffic for a brief period of time, you might be able to get by with doing something like MAC flooding. Probably one of the best ways of using MAC flooding is to use a utility called MACOF, and that's really part of a larger suite of utilities called dsniff. And this is an extremely powerful utility, not a Mac utility, a Unix utility or a Linux utility that's very, very good for this kind of stuff. Another utility you can use, and I have used this myself, by the way, is something called MAC duplicating. MAC duplicating. What you do with this is you configure your MAC address to be the same as the target that you're trying to intercept traffic from. And then what will happen is a lot of the older switches will send out their traffic to both ports where they're both identified as having that MAC address. So all I have to do is to identify the MAC address of my target. And again, that can be done with, if you're early on the network, when the person first starts up their computer, for example, it sends out a DHCP broadcast. Well, you're going to get the MAC address from it. Then you can change your MAC address to theirs, and there's a program that I've installed not too long ago here. See if I've got it here somewhere. There it is. It's called SMAC, S-M-A-C. Just do a search for this one. And what you can do with this then is you can enter in for each one of your network adapters. For example, this is my physical network adapter, this Intel Pro item. I can enter in the spoofed MAC address of my target destination. Let's say it's 00-59- whatever. And then if I just put in whatever the MAC address is of my target, update the MAC, and I now then become that MAC address on this network. Really easy utility, works very well. It's very effective that way. Other thing you might do if you don't have SMAC, although it's easy to get and this one works for Windows, is that some network adapters allow you to go directly into the properties of the network adapter and change the MAC address right there. Some network devices such as switches and hubs will also allow you to change MAC addresses on those devices as well. By the way, not that I would ever do this, but a friend of mine, let's just say that, a friend of mine says that he can just spoof a MAC address. He's being like the airport, and he'll just sniff off the network on his wireless network card, and he'll just start picking up MAC addresses. Well, then he'll spoof his MAC address to one of the MAC addresses that he picks up, which assumedly is someone that's got legitimate paid-for access to the wireless network there at the airport. And then when he spoofs that MAC address, he'll be able to also get free internet access to the wireless network there at the airport or at the hotel. Once again, I would, of course, never do that, but an unscrupulous person might do that and get free internet access. So in any case, let me return to this diagram that I've now cleaned up. If we have MAC duplicating going on here, and this is my target, and this is me right here, I've set up my MAC address to be the same as theirs. A lot of switches will then send out traffic on both ports where it detects the same MAC address. And then so we'll both be getting the traffic, and I'll be able to sniff. Again, even with this, I can't sniff all the ports on the switch unless I've got something like a flooding going on and a switch that will respond and fail back over to the hub mode that I talked about earlier. Okay, let's take a look at another issue here as well. This would be something called, and I think I've got that right here, ARP spoofing. Well, with ARP spoofing, it's real similar to ARP duplicating, and for a lot of purposes, there's the same thing. But you can use it in kind of a man-in-the-middle attack here as well. So now with ARP spoofing, we have a little bit of a different situation. Here I've got my unsuspecting target connected to the switch as usual. But of course, usually there's not a switch directly connected to the internet. Usually there's also, a firewall or a router of some kind that separates the switch and other equipment from the internet. So what happens here is this host here is going to look for its default gateway, which is going to be its router here, to direct traffic to other networks besides its own. So let's say that the IP address for this default gateway is 10.10.10.10.1. Okay, and the MAC address, let's say that ends in 0.5. Okay. .0.5. For some reason my pen's not working too well today. But anyway, that's the MAC address. So IP address and MAC address for clarification. Now, what I'll want to do here is I'll say, hey, I happen to know what the default gateway's IP address is. That's not hard to find in the network. And I'll just ping this default gateway here, and when I do that in my ARP cache, I'm going to be able to get the MAC address back for it. Let's just go ahead and do that in this case. I'll go ahead and ping my own default gateway, 10.10.10.1, and then once I've pinged it, it has resolved that IP address to a MAC address, because remember, ultimately, we go all the way down to a hardware level, and that's what the MAC address identifies as the hardware level. So I'll do an ARP cache here with an ARP -A, and that'll show me the physical addresses or the MAC addresses for all of these hosts that I've communicated with here in the past. So now I've identified the MAC address, and here I just put 05, but you get the idea. So now that that's been done, I can use some kind of a spoofing tool to give myself that MAC address. So I'll give myself the MAC address of 05. Now what happens is when this host communicates and it tries to communicate with its default gateway, instead what happens is it goes through its switch as usual, but then it makes a U-turn and says, oh, hey, the MAC address I'm looking for is actually over here on this host. So then it makes a connection to me. Now what I've got going on here is I'll have to have some kind of routing configured on my host so that I can transparently redirect that traffic back out to the switch and then back out to the actual router here so their traffic does get there, because I want to just redirect all their traffic to go through me as kind of a conduit or a detour for all of their network traffic, and as it goes through me, I then sniff that traffic. And then finally, there's physical access. Now, this is probably the least likely of all of these, because if you're trying to keep a low profile during a pen test, you're not going to have physical access to their switches or their wiring closets or anything like that. But what you could potentially do is just take one of those cheap little 5-port hubs, one of those old 5-port hubs, and plug it into the uplink port on the switch. Then you can sniff all the traffic off of that hub. So that's one possibility for how you could do that. But again, it's a little bit less likely. Now let me show you another thing here just for fun. There's a utility called DriftNet, and you can see I've typed it in the back here, but I've already installed it and launched it. And what's the purpose of this utility? This will also sniff the network, and it looks for images, and it can kind of pick out any pictures that anybody's looking at on the internet. So if I go here and I, do something like I look up, Flickr. I love this website. It's a highly addictive website where you can look at photographs that other people have taken. I can just explore Flickr and just look at all different kinds of really good photographs. Maybe that's not the best one, but there's a whole bunch of different good stuff in here. And I also post my own photographs in here. So we got some, beautiful sunsets and, some dogs and all this kind of stuff. Now, if we go back to Red Hat, look, It has, whoops, it picked up some stuff I didn't expect it to pick up there. Anyway, it's picked up a lot of those pictures there, and we can kind of sniff out what people are doing on our network and where they're going in that respect. So that's kind of a novelty tool because there's other tools that are they have to pay for. Of course, they're not free. But there's other tools such as proxy tools that will also keep track of where your users go. But this just kind of shows you the pictures. And just briefly before we conclude the recording here, let me point out that I did get back to Keops here, and it's picked up just right there. Just picked up another host, and what you can do with this is it identifies what kind of services and things are running on it, and you can then query it against a number of different things. So, for example, here I could just do a kind of a one size fits all. I could do a lot of these things that it thinks that open ports are on, and I can query against POP3, for example, send in credentials, see how it responds to whatever it is that I throw at it. You can see some of the variables down here. So this just gives us the opportunity to do a number of different things against these hosts from a central location. In this nugget, of course, we took a look at the issue of sniffing, which is the ability to pick packets off the wire that were not originally destined for us, but that we picked up anyway. Kind of a way of eavesdropping, if you will. We use a principal tool for that called Ethereal. You can download that for Linux. You can also download it for Windows. If you download the Windows version, it also includes with it WinPCAP in the latest iterations. And that will prevent you from having to install two things at once, because it includes the promiscuous driver for you also. We took a look at sniffing passwords. That was easy enough to do. You can do that with Telnet, with FTP, SMTP, SNMP, with various kinds of routers. And even websites, by the way, they're not HTTPS websites. When they pop up that dialog box for you to enter in a username and a password, you can even pick up the passwords off of that. So if someone has a membership site that they're getting access to, you can get their username and password. I didn't mention that before, but certainly you can. There's also sniffing hubs. That's pretty easy. There's not much to discuss there. It just happens. But sniffing switches is a little bit harder because you have to kind of trick the switch, or you have to trick the target that you're trying to sniff from. But in any case, it is possible. It's a lot harder than using a hub, though. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.